The obvious or next question is, how do companies measure the success and ROI of a podcast? In a world dominated by data, what are the traditional metrics to use? And as importantly, what are ways to measure ROI from a qualitative perspective? In a
Yeah.
sense, a podcast ROI is a combination of art and science. Some metrics, downloads, number of streams, subscribers, are going to be front and center. And you can look at a KPI dashboard and say to your CEO, look, the numbers are going up. But in other respects, a lot of the ROI of a podcast is hidden. It's
Mm.
behind the scenes. It's conversations that are happening. And marketers like Chris Walker talk about dark web and dark social, all those interactions, all those recommendations and brand awareness that's happening without brands even being aware of it. That's one of the challenges of a podcast, is that there are some obviously high level metrics, but lots of different ways that a success of a podcast can be measured.
So the most traditional way is to look at your podcast dashboard and see how many listens are we getting, how many unique listeners are checking us out, and per episode over the lifetime of the podcast over the last month, what do the numbers look like? How many downloads are we getting? That's the traditional way. And it's a perfectly good way in its own limited way. It does give you a sense of, are you gaining traction, or has it plateaued, or are you losing listeners? So definitely one way to look at it, but a few caveats. Number one, it does take time to build up an audience for a podcast. Just like for any channel, it depends when you're looking at the dashboard. If you've launched your podcast and you have 5 episodes out there and you've been publishing for 5 weeks in a row, and you look at the dashboard and the numbers aren't where you want them to be, that's too soon to conclude that it's not working. It just takes a while for a podcast to catch on. And it also depends how well you're promoting it. And in the bigger picture, that's just one way of measuring the value of a podcast. You already began to touch on some of the others. Another way to look at the value of a podcast is, how are we using the podcast to generate content? If you're doing it the right way, you're using a podcast as at the very center of your content generation machine, because you're starting with discussions, just like we're doing now, the most natural thing in the world. We'll probably end up recording here for probably at least 20 minutes, 25 minutes, something like that. You can easily turn our discussion here into many different kinds of content. We're recording video. You can produce the video version, produce video clips to promote in social media. You can transcribe our discussion, turn it into written content. That's valuable in 2 specific ways. One, the efficiency of it. It's a lot easier to go from a spoken conversation that you've transcribed, that's been recorded, and then turn that into written content, because you're already starting with the content there as opposed to starting from scratch. And also, I think just the quality of the content. There's something about a conversation, especially between 2 people who don't already know each other. We're exchanging ideas and kind of sparking off each other, and it can lead to insights or ways of looking at things that are fresher and newer than you might get when you're just cranking out yet another blog post from your internal subject matter experts you've already gone to many times. It can start to sound a little bit the same. So I think that the quality of the content, again, if you're doing it the right way, can be higher. There's that content generation piece of it. And then also there's who you're talking to on the podcast. I think a lot of people that I talk to in the very early exploring stages, they kind of assume like, well, we'll be talking to the people at our company, our subject matter experts. And I say, okay, yes, you definitely should, especially in the early phase of the podcast when you're just getting going to establish it. But then as soon as you can, you need to start reaching out to people outside your company, outside subject matter experts, and especially folks who, if you're working closely with sales, are also your prospects. And this just makes sense. With all your marketing, you're aiming it at your audience, which is composed of your prospects. Same thing with a podcast. The difference is that you can invite people onto your podcast you want to get to know and talk to. And I think that is a major part of the value. You're having in-depth discussions, both in prep calls before and then during the podcast, with the very people you need to get to know in order to grow your business. And a podcast is a way to do that. That's not a sales conversation. You're not trying to sell anything. It's low pressure. It really is just shining the spotlight on your guest and getting to know them in a way that can really help build the kinds of relationships that you need in order to advance people, to get people into your pipeline and then advance them down your pipeline. I think that's where a lot of the value lies. And when you combine that with the audience that you can also grow from a brand awareness standpoint, and if you package that together with the content that you're generating for your other channels, look at it more holistically like that. And I think you can begin to see the value coming into shape that's more robust and well beyond just the raw numbers you get on a dashboard.